the Lord has other sheep, and these two he must bring, and there will be one shepherd and one fold. We notice that the sheep recognize the voice, and the shepherd knows each one by name. Some years ago I was giving a retreat in a Benedictine monastery in France, and after it was over, one of the young monks showed me his workplace in the monastic complex, which was that of looking after these goats. And I was intrigued to see how each goat had a name, and indeed a personality. They were not just much of a muchness, but each one counted, and he was really caring personally for each goat. We notice also that the Lord makes himself recognizable when he dares to call Mary Magdalene in that case, by her name. Then she realizes immediately who is standing before her, and she exclaims, and indeed makes for him physically, "Do not cling to me, for I am not yet ascended to my Father." Well, the Lord has that care, as indeed anyone who exercises a role of shepherding has care. One is not sitting at a board meeting or indeed playing a chess game. The shepherd of the flock has to love them into being. And it is no use having a church full of perfect administrators if that personal care is missing. The supreme shepherd is the successor of Peter. And I would like to tell you a story indicating that the Lord honors that, protects it, and upholds it. And without it, the structure is incomplete. Recently, we saw that the present Holy Father spent a long time in personal and private conversation with one of the most important leaders of Christendom, the head of the Moscow Patriarchate. Moscow is the church easiest to negotiate with. There are parts of the Eastern Church that are more obtuse, notably the very faithful monastic setup at Mount Athos, but it is difficult to dialogue with them with the same elasticity, and therefore there are problems. The Russian church has a certain dynamism, and one is able to get through. So it is interesting that it is to the Patriarch of Moscow that he went. The head, really, of the Eastern Bloc as such is actually the Patriarch of New Rome, as they would call it. The old Constantinople, which comes through in the modern Istanbul, the same word, Byzantium. He is the ecumenical patriarch, and he would have that leadership role. Indeed, that was recognized when Blessed Paul VI went and encountered Patriarch Athenagoras at the time of the Second Vatican Council, and with great tenderness embraced him, and when they solemnly together as heads lifted the ancient mutual excommunication which had been launched, East against West and West against East. Now, before abdicating, Benedict XVI drew up an important document which did not hit the headlines, but it was important because of the care that went into it. He, being a brilliant theologian, proposed with meticulous detail and love and care as a shepherd, a way in which to heal this breach which has gone on for 1,000 years out of 2, since 1054. He knew all the issues. He knew also that his bloc, he is Patriarch of the West, is more able to negotiate, dialogue and adapt than the East. So we presume that he could see way forwards in which, with also a minimum of goodwill on the part of the East, things could once again be complete. Because they do actually know secretly that they're not complete, because Peter is missing. They won't like to say that, but they know it from their own history. No ecumenical council can happen without Peter. And so, it would be probable that if it were to happen, the date of Easter would actually be that of the East. We, under Pope Gregory way back, adopted the Gregorian calendar, named after him, re-establishing what had been lost with regard to the time lapse getting bigger every year. But we lost Easter and things in common. They have the ancient calendar of Julius Caesar, but unchanged. And it is interesting that the Lord didn't change when it came to the annual miracle of the Holy Fire, which happens on Holy Saturday in the Holy Sepulchre, ever since it was built. And that happens, therefore, in the hands of those who have care of it historically, the Greeks. The Patriarch then would be the successor of St. James, the Apostle, Bishop of Jerusalem. And that is the date that it happens, therefore the Easter date. And if one looks carefully at what is coming through in certain mystics, such as, now I'm not going to whether it's authentic or not, but it's there in Ursula, others similar, one sees in there that actually, yes, it's the Eastern date that the Lord probably actually would take as the one to unite. It also would make a lot of political sense because the East, as I say, is difficult to change. They just don't change. We don't do change. Therefore, there's a certain security in that force coming through, because it also shows us history standing still. They've stayed as they were at the moment of separation. Now, I want to go into it also from another angle, but to do so, I'm going to tell you a story. This happened in Italy. There was a young man who, like many an Italian, received only rudimentary religious education, but had an instinctive faith. He did his military service and married at the age of 23. The lassie was Yolanta. He was finding it difficult to make ends meet, so he volunteered in the militia, but actually in the Spanish Civil War, on the nationalist side, even though by then he was actually more inclined towards communism himself. And indeed, once in Spain, he came under another influence. This time it was that of a German Protestant, who managed to convince him that the papacy was the cause of all the world's ills. As a result, he conceived a profound hatred for the church of his childhood, and went as far as vowing that he would actually kill the Pope. Indeed, he bought a dagger with that purpose, and had inscribed on it, Morte al Papa, death to the Pope. His wife was not enthusiastic about this new orientation. He actually became quite abusive towards her, and he destroyed all the Catholic traces within the family home. That is, abusive, not presumably physically, but be fairly keen on alienating his wife, from anything that was familiar. He eventually went to a pretty extreme form of Protestantism. He went to an Adventist church. By then he was back in Rome, and he was trying to get his wife into the same sect. What was she to do? Well, she agreed, reluctantly, but on one condition: that first he should make the first 9 Fridays the devotion. Therefore she still had quite a bit of Catholic life in her. And if at the end of that he was still determined to become a Protestant, she would actually come along with him. But she secretly trusted that God would somehow convert her husband. However, at the end of these 9 months, he was still set on joining the Adventists. So reluctantly, she followed suit. From 1939 to 1947, he worked as a tram conductor in Rome. And by the latter date, they had 3 children. 2 boys, Carlo, aged 7, and Gianfranco, aged 4, and a girl, Isola, aged 10. Well, there was actually quite a bit of abuse going on. He wasn't a particularly good husband by this stage. There was physical abuse already in the marriage, and this was causing a lot of distress, not only to the wife, but to the children, who were copying on. Things weren't exactly serene. By this stage, he was actually a convinced communist, and he still had plans to kill the Pope. On the Saturday after Easter, 12th of April 1947, he set off for the afternoon with his children. On the following day, Sunday, he was due to give an anti-Catholic and indeed anti-Marian talk, and he wanted a chance to plan out what he would say. By the way, at that time it was just Low Sunday. By now that's Divine Mercy Sunday, which is interesting in itself. They took the bus to Tre Fontane, that means 3 fountains, a sacred place, for that is where St. Paul had his head chopped off and bounced 3 times, from which gushed forth Tre Fontane, 3 fountains. I've been there more than once, and a friend of our community, Don Jacques, is the abbot. He was just an ordinary monk, wasn't a priest, and they wanted him to be their abbot. He was a Frenchman in an Italian community, and the community is actually a daughter house of Quinterzen in France, La Trappe. And so he found himself elected abbot, but he wasn't a priest. So that was reported to the Vatican, which gave all the dispensations, and he was ordained deacon, priest, and made abbot, one after the other. He's still there. And it's a beautiful house, actually, just on the outskirts of the centre of Rome. So they took the bus to Tre Fontane, where the shop at this Trappist monastery was famed for its chocolate. Once there, while waiting for the shop to open at about 4 o'clock, after the siesta, he sat down in the shade to plan his talk, while the children played with a ball on some waste ground nearby. At about 3:20, he was disturbed by the children shouting for their lost ball. But as he helped with the search, the youngest, Gianfranco, promptly went missing himself. The father discovered him in a small cave or grotto, smiling, with hands joined as he knelt and repeated the words, "Bella donna! Bella donna!" Beautiful lady, beautiful lady. Daddy couldn't make head nor tail of it. So he called first to Isola and then to Carlo, who both came and saw the "Bella donna!" All three children were entranced and oblivious of his shouts. He became frightened after he was unable to lift them and called out angrily into the empty cave. Finally, in desperation, he cried out, "God help us!" At this, he saw two transparent hands which touched his face and wiped his eyes, causing him pain. Then he saw a tiny light in the cave which grew more luminous as he felt an interior sensation of great joy. Finally, he saw a beautiful woman with a motherly but sad expression, wearing a green mantle over her white dress and with a rose-coloured sash around her waist. In her hands she held an ash-grey book close to her breast, while at her feet he could see a crucifix which had been smashed on top of a black cloth. She called herself La Vergine della Rivelazione, the Virgin of the Revelation, or of Revelation, because it doesn't quite work the same way in Italian, the we put in. And spoke to Bruno slowly and rhythmically for about an hour and 20 minutes. He could remember every word afterwards. It was like a recording he could replay time and time again. But the children only saw her lips move and heard nothing. Our Lady revealed herself thus: "I am she who is related to the Divine Trinity. I am the Virgin of Revelation. You have persecuted me. Now is the time to stop. Come and be part of the Holy Fold, which is the celestial court on earth. God's promise is unchangeable and will remain so. The 9 First Fridays in honor of the Sacred Heart, which your faithful wife persuaded you to observe before you walked down the road of lies, has saved you." She counseled him, "Live the divine doctrine. Practice," now notice this bit, practice what? Christianity. She could have used the word Catholicism. That's an interesting choice of words. It's not indifferent, as you'll see in a minute. And then live the faith. La fede. That also is interesting vocabulary. while also saying, "The Hail Marys that you pray with faith and love are the golden arrows that go straight to the heart of Jesus." Now remember where he's coming from, the Protestant critique of vain repetition. The rosary is prime target. And pray much and recite the rosary. Now that's linking up with Fatima. The one request made each time in all 6 apparitions in Fatima was say the rosary every day. Pray much and recite the rosary for the conversion of sinners, of unbelievers, and of all, what is again, Christians. She indicated future conversions and cures with these words, "I promise this special favour. With this sinful soil of the grotto, I shall perform great miracles for the conversion of unbelievers and of sinners." Now it's called sinful because of what used to go on in that particular part of Rome. It had a bad reputation, that corner. It was semi-private. She also spoke of future problems. This, by the way, comes to us. Science will deny God and will refuse his calls. Now this next bit is historically important. Remember the date, it's 1947. In particular, she spoke of her assumption into heaven, outlining her life during her 80-minute talk. And remember earlier on it said that he could remember this miraculously, word for word, all this conversation, as though it was a tape in his head. Special grace, therefore. And she goes on to talk about the assumption. My body could not and did not decay. I was assumed into heaven by my Son and the angels. She gave him too a secret message for the Pope. You must go to, now she doesn't use the word Pope, she says, the Holy Father. And she goes on, the Pope, the supreme pastor of what? Christianity. And personally tell him my message. Bring it to his attention. Now, what are bits of this message? Did you notice there was a commentary on the as yet undefined assumption in 1947? I shall tell you how to recognize the one who will accompany you to see the Pope, because there's no way he was going to get to the Pope. God is also providence and wisdom. Finally, it was over, and after smiling at him and the children, Mary turned round, walked through the wall of the grotto, and disappeared. He was in a daze. Although the children were excited as they all made their way to the Trappist church to pray in thanksgiving. Before going home, they all went back to the cave, where they encountered a beautiful fragrance, where previously some kind of prostitution had been going on, presumably. And all the more surprising because its floor was covered with filth. So the man cleared a space and used his door key to scratch this message. On the 12th of April 1947, the Virgin of Revelation appeared in this grotto to the Protestant Bruno Cornacchiola and his children, and he was converted. He told the children to say nothing, but that would encourage them in a way that the child could be told not to say anything and not to say anything straight away, so that only got things moving very quickly. So, word goes round. The wife smelt this beautiful perfume emanating from them all. And Bruno told his wife all that had happened. He begged forgiveness on his knees for the way he had treated her. So, Bruno eventually found a priest to advise him, so that he and Yolanda could rejoin the church as the story spread and the numbers of pilgrims grew, with articles on the apparition beginning to appear in the press. We and the children were even questioned separately at length by the police, but they were unable to find any significant difference in their accounts. The local church authorities also carried out an investigation, and the cult of the Virgin of Revelation was approved with unusual speed by the Vicariate of Rome. As the number of pilgrims grew, the area around the grotto had to be altered to make it safer and more accessible. A special statue representing Mary during the apparition was blessed by Pope Pius XII on the 5th of October 1947, and then taken in procession amidst huge crowds from St. Peter's Square to Trefontane. That was fairly close to the feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, the 7th of October. Now listen to this. Just 2 years later, on the 9th of December 1949, Bruno was part of a group invited to pray the Rosary with Pius XII in his private chapel as part of the beginning of the 1950 Holy Year celebrations. After the Rosary, the Pope asked if anyone wanted to speak to him. Bruno immediately came forward and knelt at his feet, and with tears in his eyes showed the dagger with which he had intended to kill him, and his Protestant Bible. He begged forgiveness, which Pius XII unhesitatingly gave. In fact, according to one account, it seems that Pius XII had an awareness of what was going to happen for at least 10 years. Since in 1937, while still a cardinal, he had a meeting with a holy woman who had apparently seen Mary in a vision at Trefontane. She related how the Virgin had told her that she would return to the grotto and convert a man who wanted to assassinate the Pope, and moreover that he, Cardinal Pacelli, would himself be Pope. Remember, he was nuncio in Munich, and he knew the Nazi music. He wrote with Brendan Sorge in German, not in Italian or in Latin. In his own good German, he tried to save Germany from itself. And then when the Bishop of Utrecht defended the Catholic Church against the tendency of these Nazis to do immoral acts, immediately there was an increase of persecution of Catholics. And the Pope, who was about to publish another bombardment of Nazism, burnt what he had written. And history never saw it. He's been criticized wrongly for being pro-Nazi. He was trying to limit the damage, because if he made Catholics even more uncomfortable, he made his own more vulnerable to torture and brag. he replied cautiously, just saying he would wait and see. But in 1939, Eugenio Pacelli duly became Pope Pius XII. Given all this, it is understandable that the cult of the apparitions at Tre Fontane was approved so rapidly. And not only that, but in that same holy year, shortly after this event, it was actually the 1st of November, Feast of All Saints, what was believed but not actually defined became part of our dogma. The Lady was indeed assumed, body and soul, into heaven, which the East believes mystically and embryonically but doesn't like to put down on paper. They call it the falling asleep, the dormition, kinesis, without defining whether she died or not. I will just pause on the fact that this is one of the rare interventions of heaven where Catholic dogma in its fullness has been upheld directly by heaven. It is reported that at Medjugorje, the children years ago in the 80s had brought this question to Our Lady. This problem they had, seeing all these other Christians coming and going and whatnot. And that Our Lady has answered in the initial stages to help them to understand that the mentality of heaven is not quite the same as ours, but that her Son leads his followers as a king leads all his armies. But she did add this, that the fact that all my apparitions are in the Catholic Church should tell you something. It was a hint. But these interventions are still there, and they're everywhere. The Lord is defending his church, now against very powerful means. He's also trying to remind Catholics themselves of what they have, and which they themselves are attacking. The attack on the sacred is the infiltration of a terrible Trojan horse. Divide and conquer, but this time attack from within. And so we have this plethora of things happening right now in our celebrations and afterwards. This happened not that long ago in India. You can see that the face of the Lord is there quite clearly on the host and still continues there. You can see it more clearly there again. And these, yeah, of course, it's a big assembly. So it's just reminding us, because our Lord was asked about this by some privileged soul, and he replied to this soul who would prefer not to have to do these miracles, but it was because, in a sense, of our hardness of heart. It happens quite a lot, actually, when these hosts which fall to the ground are not consumed, but put in water to dissolve. The Lord doesn't seem to be too happy about that, and reacts by making it not dissolve, but actually turn into visible flesh and blood. So these are hints. The Lord is not noisy, but he gets his message through. That's a very clear one there. That's, in that case, exposed well in the monstrance, but it's very clearly the Lord's face. And this one is somebody just like yourself using a cell phone during adoration. She was in adoration somewhere, and that's what she could see. Or maybe she couldn't see it, but the camera could. It's Our Lady, but you can see the silhouette of Our Lady there also in adoration. She's very much aware where her Son is and hurts. She hurts when her Son hurts. So just be aware when you do it. There's more there. When you do your adoration, which I know pretty well all of you do, as far as I can make out, you're all into prayer here. Remember now that you're there with the angels and saints, making up for what right now is coming not necessarily from Protestants who are trying to destroy the church from without, or communists or Freemasons, but now, in a more subtle and therefore efficacious way, from within, division and loss of faith, beginning with the children, the church of tomorrow. Just bear that in mind when you come to your God in preparatory adoration.
to bother.